Well, my apologies for getting cut off right at the end of the last screencast. I do get interested in what I'm talking about from time to time and tend to forget what the time is. So it's 15 minutes. That's what I have. Well, let's go back to looking at this theoretical context excerpt from Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited from pages 3 and 4. We were looking at the way that they set up what I am arguing is a false dichotomy between world system theories and everything else. And we got to the point where they were talking about how Shriver and Steiner-Kamsky, other theorists, see the global flow of educational ideas as rising and ebbing over time within shifting political contexts, as policymakers in some eras use the forum cache of educational ideas from abroad to justify domestic policy reforms. So the use of foreign educational ideas to justify domestic policy reforms is something that they're saying somehow contradicts the world system theory approach. They're also saying that at other times, policymakers strip imported ideas of their aura of foreignness to make them more domestically palatable. This is externalities, and the idea of externalities from Jürgen Shriver. And at still other times, they reject and expel foreign ideas as dangerous and unwelcome. And then he goes on to say that educational ethnographers, such as Catherine Anderson Levitt, tend to contrast the homogenizing force of globalization with the resilience of local educational cultures. And here again we have this idea that globalization and homogenization are somehow the same thing. Well, what I find interesting about that is that, and let's go back, I'm sorry, I'm taking us way back here to this. We said, why are schools more homogeneous across countries than would be predicted by the actual variability of national societies and cultures? What we didn't do was ask a better question. Right? What is it that is homogeneous? Is it the ideas and practices? Right? We had ideas and practices. If that's what's more homogeneous, then what is interesting is that there is no real distinguishing characteristic between what they say world system theory says and what other people say when it comes to shared ideas and practices. But what's also interesting as we read through Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited is that they argue that there is in many ways, a very unique and distinct difference between the preschools that they look at in China and Japan and the United States. So where do we fall on this spectrum of seeing the world as an increasingly globalized system and charting a growing convergence over time in national educational ideas and practices, and this idea that there are different uses and different ways, even sometimes to reject foreign ideas as dangerous and welcome? In other words, does this perspective, according to Tobin, Say, and Karasawa, mean that globalization is only homogenization of education ideas and practices in the strict sense, or could it be that when there is a shared rejection or expulsion of foreign ideas as dangerous and welcome, that also could be a shared perspective? I'm not really sure that I'm conveying that the way I want to, so let's move on a little bit. And let's do that by talking about policy convergence and what that means. Because we can contrast policy convergence with isomorphism, with something called policy diffusion, and with policy transfer. If we're talking about convergence, then we're emphasizing the effects of a process of policy change over time towards a common point. And let me skip ahead to a slide. That's not it. Let me skip ahead to a slide that is the one I want to go to. Thank you. Convergence. Right? This is the idea that you start here and over time you end up in the same spot. I did it with curvy lines. We could just as easily do it, here's Here's Chinese preschools, here's Japanese preschools, and here's US preschools. And over time, they converge and they become the same. Right? Is that the way that Tobin, Say, and Kurosawa are talking about convergence? Let me go back, if I can find it, to our, here we go, to our slide. So, policy convergence research emphasizes this movement towards the same thing. That's convergence. Or if you wanted to look at it sort of carrying on, the moment when these cross, that's convergence. Well, what are some mechanisms of policy convergence? Because there is actually a broad literature on this. And so if we wanted to, we could look at how policy convergence has been theorized as well as empirically measured. Holtzinger and Nil are actually two very well-known European scholars who have looked at the mechanisms of policy convergence. And they have said that there are 5, roughly, categories of mechanisms that we can look at. One is imposition. This is force, right? It's saying that you will do this because I'm in charge of you for whatever reason. One is through a process of independent problem solving, where they argue that schools or systems or policymakers or individuals will work through a problem and say, you know what, we need to do it like they do. This is the way that we're going to best solve our problem, and it just so happens that it looks like what they're doing. This idea of international harmonization. Well, let's try to align. This is what the policymakers would say. Let's try to align with what other people are doing, especially other people that are doing it the way that we think we should, or that have the kinds of outcomes or context or environment or economy or whatever that we would like to have. Let's harmonize that way. One is through regulatory competition. This is a way, these are mechanisms that regulate and limit what is possible in more and more ways so that the boundaries, the ways that you can vary, tend to decrease. And then another is transnational communication. By simply having a discourse, by communicating across systems or across countries or from individual to individual with that are not in the same system or context, policies can converge over time. This would be more like the normative version that I'll talk about in a second. It's not necessarily because of imposition or problem solving or harmonization or competition. It's simply a result of slow but eventual shared ideas and thinking. They say in this same article that I've cited down at the bottom that transnational problem solving typically occurs within transnational elite networks or epistemic communities, which are defined as, and you can tell I think it's important because I put it in blue, networks of policy experts who share common principled beliefs over ends, causal beliefs over means, and common standards of accruing and testing new knowledge. And they say that common educational and normative backgrounds typically facilitate joint development of common policy models in such constellations. Such a European word there. Okay. Now, what are they saying? Networks of policy experts who share some beliefs about ends and about means and about standards. Well, who are the networks of experts that we're talking about here? Now, if we were talking about international testing, I could name you some people. Right? We'd be talking about Andreas Schleicher from the OECD, who does all the PISA work. We could be talking about Hans Wagenmacher, or Wagemaker if you say it with the American accent, from the IEA, who does all the TIMS stuff. Or we could talk about a guy named Wolfram Schultz, who last time I knew him worked for the Australian Council for Educational Research, but has also had influence in both the IEA and the OECD's educational testing. Right, those would be policy experts that are networked together, who communicate with one another, who share common principle beliefs, causal beliefs, common standard beliefs. Right? Now, in the case of Preschool in Three Cultures Revisited, who are the policy experts that are networking? If Tobin, Say, and Kurosawa are arguing that policy convergence is one of the options, then we need to think about the policy experts. So I'm turning that over to you. Who are the experts who are networking? That might be one of the reasons why convergence is on the table. Humphrey, another another scholar who talks about policy convergence, has said that there are various stimuli for international policy convergence through international policy promotion, and that they are often non-binding international agreements or propositions on goals and standards that national policies should aim to achieve, that institutionalized peer review and identification of best practice or benchmarking, as well as the construction of league tables. Those are ranking systems for educational systems. League tables that rank national policies in terms of performance to previously agreed criteria. But again, you can tell the part that I think is important because I put it in blue. Non-binding international agreements or propositions. How are there non-binding international agreements or propositions? Well, one of the ways that we can think about them is, for example, there's something called Education for All, which is a policy proposition or international agreement that is relatively non-binding, sponsored by UNESCO, but there are more than 100 or more, actually, definitely more than 100 signatory nations who've agreed to the Education for All propositions. We could talk about the World Bank's Millennium Development Goals and how those are non-binding international agreements or propositions, even though some World Bank donor recipients might be more bound to it than other countries. There's still international agreements or propositions that are out there that education policymakers all over the world, including China, Japan, and the United States, are aware of. That educators in early childhood education are also influenced by, even if they don't know what Education for All is or what the Millennium Development Goals are exactly, they're influenced by those in the larger education system who do know. So we have these networks of policy experts, we have these non-binding international agreements or propositions. And those are ways that policy convergence, Holtzinger, Nill, and Humphreys argue occurs. So what are the non-binding international agreements or propositions that pop up in our chapter on China, for example, from Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited? Is there anything that's actually mentioned or stated that suggests that there would be an agreement or a proposition that has international legitimacy and is referred to or somehow a part of decision making and behavior and activity that occurs in early childhood education, specifically in the preschools in these three countries? Let's pause here. Let's reorient ourselves with some of the institutional assertions we looked at last week, and then let's move forward again with Preschool and Three Cultures.